You were never meant to be part of my future, Rachel. You were just a chapter I needed to get through.
What? No, you can't mean that. I thought we had something real.
Daniel looked me dead in the eyes, right there in the middle of Clayton Harbor Fish Market, with fish scales on my hands and sawdust on my boots, and said, "You were never meant to be part of my future. Rachel, you were just a chapter I needed to get through." Then he handed me the envelope himself, a divorce petition from Clayton County Family Court, and walked away like he hadn't just destroyed the woman who skipped meals so he could buy law textbooks. Inside, he accused me of cheating with my fish supplier. He claimed our house. He called me uneducated, unstable, and an embarrassment to his career. The same career I had built for him dollar by dollar, fish by fish, 6 years of 3 a.m. mornings, and borrowed money and silent sacrifices. So what do you do when the man you made uses the law you paid for to erase you? If this story already has you feeling something, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we share real stories about real people who refused to stay erased. Before Daniel handed me that envelope before the courthouse and the accusations and the cold look on his face as he walked away, there was just me and the fish market and a blue notebook I carried everywhere. My name is Rachel Brooks, and I have worked at Clayton Harbor Fish Market since I was 22 years old. My stall was mine, built from scratch, paid for, and full stocked with fish I bought before sunrise and sold before noon. I kept a blue ledger notebook where I tracked everything. How many red snapper I bought each morning. How many pounds of smoked mullet I sold on Saturdays, which customers still owed me money, and how much I was putting aside to eventually replace the old chest freezer that rattled like it had a grudge against me. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it was entirely mine. The two people I spent the most time with were Megan Reed and Linda Hayes. Megan ran the produce stall right next to mine and had the kind of directness that could make a grown man flinch. She said exactly what she thought every single time without apology. Linda was the oldest vendor at the market, a woman in her late 60s who called everyone baby and brought homemade biscuits on Fridays. She had seen enough of life to know when something was about to go sideways before anyone else did. These two women were my daily world, and for a long time that world felt like enough. Ethan Parker supplied fish to most of the small vendors in the market, including me. He was quiet, reliable, and never once shorted a delivery. He showed up on time, kept his word, and didn't waste people's time with small talk. In a business built on trust and cold temperatures that mattered more than most people realized. I met Daniel Carter on an ordinary Wednesday morning when an argument broke out near the cold storage entrance. One of the fishermen, a regular named Old Pete, had his entire haul locked inside Bayfront cold storage because the owner claimed Pete hadn't paid his monthly storage fee. Pete was furious, insisting he had paid, and the two of them were going back and forth loud enough to draw a crowd. Daniel was there by accident, or at least that's what he said later. He was a law student at Jefferson School of Law, cutting through the market on his way to campus, and he stopped because he knew how to read a contract. He didn't yell. He didn't take sides. He asked for the paperwork from both men, read through the storage agreement quietly, and pointed out a clause that required the owner to provide written notice before locking out a tenant. Pete hadn't received any notice. The owner backed down. The whole thing was over in 12 minutes. I watched Daniel hand the paperwork back with the calm expression of someone who already knew how the story ended, and something about that steadiness stayed with me long after the crowd dispersed. We started talking, and he told me about law school, specifically about how he was on the verge of losing his spot because he couldn't cover the next semester's registration fee. His father had passed away 2 years earlier, and his mother, Patricia, was doing what she could, but it wasn't enough. He didn't ask me for anything. He was just explaining his situation to someone who had asked a direct question. But I kept thinking about the way he had stood in that crowd and solved a problem that had nothing to do with him simply because he could. I went home that night, sat at my kitchen table with my blue notebook open in front of me, and added up what I had saved toward the new freezer. The next morning, I brought the money to Daniel. Megan found out the same afternoon and was not subtle about her opinion. She told me I had lost my mind, that I had handed my freezer fund to a man I had known for less than 48 hours because he could talk his way through a contract dispute. She wasn't wrong to say it. But I had already made the decision, and something in my chest told me it was the right one, even if I couldn't explain why yet. Daniel looked at the money like he didn't know what to do with someone's generosity. He said he would not forget what I had done. He meant it at the time. I believe that now that he meant it, then even if the meaning faded later, like ink left in the sun, we fell in love slowly, and then all at once the way things tend to happen when two people keep finding reasons to be near each other. We got married on a Saturday in the spring, with Linda crying into a paper napkin and Megan standing next to me with her arms crossed like she was guarding something valuable. I was the happiest I had ever been. I thought the hard part was behind us. It wasn't. It was just getting started. Law school cost more than either of us had planned for. Beyond the tuition, there were textbooks that ran to several $100s each semester, bar prep courses, application fees, professional clothes for mock trial competitions, and the rent on a small apartment closer to campus, so Daniel didn't lose 2 hours a day commuting. I went back to my blue notebook and did the math over and over, trying to find a version of the numbers that worked without me stretching myself thin. There wasn't one, so I stretched anyway. I started buying fish on credit from Bayfront Cold Storage, which meant I owed money before I made any. I added a cleaning service on the side, washing and prepping fish for 2 restaurants that didn't want to deal with the mess themselves. I started doing early delivery runs to diners that opened at 6 in the morning. On weekends, I smoked mullet and packaged it myself, selling it out of a cooler near the back of the market because the margins were better. Every dollar I made above what I needed to eat and keep the stall running went toward Daniel's education. I sold the bracelet my mother had left me. I stopped buying new clothes. There were weeks when I ate the unsold fish at the end of the day, not because it was bad, but because spending money on groceries felt like a luxury I hadn't earned yet. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself we were building something. Ethan noticed I was losing weight. He brought it up once quietly while we were going over an order together near the loading dock. He said I looked like I was disappearing into someone else's plans. I thanked him for the concern and changed the subject. He didn't push. He never pushed about anything. That was something I appreciated about him then, without fully understanding how rare it was. It was around this time, somewhere in Daniel's 2nd year of law school, that his mother Patricia showed up at the market looking for me. She was a thin, well-dressed woman with careful posture and the kind of expression that made you feel you were already failing some test she hadn't announced yet. She found me at my stall during a slow hour and told me she knew I was supporting Daniel. She said it the way someone might acknowledge a fact they found slightly distasteful. She didn't thank me. Instead, she said that once Daniel finished school, his life would belong to a different world. And she wanted me to understand that she wasn't sure there was a place for me in it. I told her I was the one building that world alongside him. She looked at my hands, at the fish scales and the calluses and the small cuts that came from handling crates all day, and didn't answer. She just picked up her bag and walked back through the market without another word. Megan had watched the whole exchange from her stall. When Patricia was gone, she leaned over and said, "That woman looked at you like you were something she was planning to throw out." I shook my head and told Megan she was reading too much into it. Patricia was a mother protecting her son. That's what mothers did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been evaluated and found insufficient by the woman whose son I was keeping in law school with fish money. Daniel passed the bar exam on his first attempt. When the results came in, the entire market celebrated like one of their own had done something remarkable because they felt like they had. Linda baked a cake. Megan put a handwritten sign on her stall that said, "Our Rachel's husband is a lawyer now." Several vendors who had extended me credit shook my hand and said they had never doubted me for a moment. I stood in the middle of all that warmth and felt genuinely proud for the first time in years of everything we had survived to get here. Daniel was hired at Harrison and Blake Law Offices, one of the most established firms in downtown Port Clayton. I thought that was the door opening. I didn't know yet that he was already planning to walk through it alone. The changes came gradually at first. He started asking me to call him Attorney Carter in front of others, which I assumed was a joke until I realized it wasn't. He corrected my pronunciation of legal terms over dinner with the patience of someone who had stopped expecting much. He mentioned once carefully that my work clothes carried a smell that clung and asked if I could maybe change before coming downtown. Then he asked me not to mention the old debts in front of his colleagues because it made the early years sound more desperate than he wanted people to know. The afternoon I brought him lunch at the office was the afternoon I understood how far things had already shifted. A woman at the front desk asked who I was. Daniel came out into the lobby, looked at me holding the container I had packed that morning, and introduced me as someone from the old neighborhood. Not his wife, not Rachel. Someone from the old neighborhood, like I was a stranger who happened to know his coffee order. I carried the lunch back to my car and drove to the market and sold fish for the rest of the day without saying anything to anyone about what had happened. That night, when I asked him about it, he told me I was making a situation out of nothing. He said his colleagues asked too many questions and he was just trying to keep things simple. Patricia had stopped being subtle by then too. At a family dinner she hosted around that time, she said directly in front of Daniel that a lawyer's wife should not be standing in an open-air market shouting prices at customers. She said it embarrassed him. She said it limited his image. And Daniel sat at the head of the table and said nothing. Not one word in my direction. He just refilled his water glass and let his mother's words settle over the table like dust. I drove home that night and made a decision. I enrolled in evening classes. I read through legal documents to understand the language Daniel lived in. I changed how I dressed when I visited him at the office. I started closing my stall earlier so I could be home before he arrived. I told myself that if I could just adapt quickly enough, if I could just close the gap between where I was and where he wanted me to be, the man I had married would come back. I was willing to become someone different if it meant saving what we had built. What I didn't know then was that Daniel had already decided what he was building next, and it didn't include me. Daniel started mentioning Claire Bennett the same week he stopped coming home for dinner. Claire was a lawyer at Harrison, and Blake Sharp well-connected, the kind of woman who had grown up knowing which fork to use at a formal dinner and which judge to call when you needed a favor. Daniel talked about her the way people talk about someone they're trying to impress, which might have been manageable if he hadn't also started talking about me the way people talk about something they're embarrassed to explain. He admired the way Claire argued in front of clients. He admired her composure. He said she understood the pressure of building a career in a world that didn't hand you anything. What he didn't say, but what became clearer with every week that passed, was that Claire represented everything he now wanted to be associated with, and I represented everything he was trying to leave behind. He came home later and later. The dinners I kept warm on the stove went uneaten. When he did sit at the table, he was somewhere else entirely answering texts or reviewing documents, and the silence between us was no longer the comfortable kind. I kept trying. I told myself that new jobs were demanding, and that adjustment took time, that he was under pressure. I couldn't fully understand that the right version of our marriage was still there, somewhere beneath all the distance. I was very good at finding reasons to keep trying. I had been doing it for 6 years. What broke the pattern wasn't an argument. It was a chest freezer. It died on a Thursday morning, in the middle of a heat wave, without any warning at all, just a strange grinding noise, and then nothing. I had 8 crates of fish sitting inside it, product I had already paid for, on credit from Bayfront Cold Storage product I could not afford to lose. I stood in front of that broken freezer and did the math in my head, and understood immediately that if those 8 crates spoiled, I would have nothing left to pay my supplier debt, and nothing to restock with. I would lose the stall. I would lose everything I had kept running through 6 years of 3 a.m. mornings, and skipped meals and borrowed money. I called Daniel 4 times. He didn't pick up. I left one voicemail explaining exactly what was happening and what I needed, and then I put my phone in my pocket and started thinking about who else I could call. Before I finished the thought, Ethan Parker's delivery truck was already pulling into the back lot. He had a refrigerated vehicle large enough to hold everything, and without me asking him to do anything, except help me think, he was already moving crates. We transferred all 8 loads to a secondary cold storage unit across the harbor in under 2 hours. Not a single pound was lost. Afterward, when we were standing in the parking lot, and I was still trying to get my breathing back to normal, Ethan told me something he had been keeping to himself for a while. He said he cared about me in a way that went beyond business, and that he wanted me to know that. He was direct about it the way he was direct about everything. No performance, no pressure, just honesty. But he also said immediately that he wasn't going to do anything with that feeling that would damage my marriage. He said he had seen what I had sacrificed to build my life, and he respected it too much to become a complication in it. Then he asked me if there was anything else I needed, and when I said no, he said he'd have the regular Friday delivery ready by 6 a.m., and he drove away. I told him to keep his distance after that. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because I knew the difference between a man who respects a boundary and a marriage that was already cracking, and I didn't want those two things anywhere near each other. Ethan accepted that without argument. He kept delivering on time, kept his messages professional, kept showing up to do exactly what he said he would do and nothing more. The line he had drawn for himself, he held. Daniel called back 4 hours after the freezer died. When I explained what had happened and that Ethan had helped me save the inventory, the first thing he said wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "Why was Ethan the one you called?" I reminded him that I hadn't called Ethan. Ethan had arrived on his own. Daniel said that was somehow worse. Things were already unraveling by then, but they came apart completely on a night when Daniel didn't come home at all. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my blue notebook open in front of me and stared at 6 years of numbers, all those careful rows of fish weights and sale totals and transfers to Daniel's account. And I felt something shift inside me, some final piece of hope that had been holding on quietly, finally letting go. The next morning I drove to the harbor before the market opened. I sat down on the concrete behind Bayfront Cold Storage and I cried, not the kind of crying you can stop if someone walks by, but the other kind. Ethan was making an early delivery when he saw me. He didn't call out or make a scene. He just walked over and stood nearby. He didn't reach for me. He didn't say anything designed to fill the silence. He was just present in the quiet, deliberate way that was simply who he was. That was when Daniel appeared. He had been looking for me, or maybe he had followed me, I still don't know which. He came around the corner and saw Ethan standing near me while I was sitting on the ground with red eyes, and he made his decision about what that meant before he had taken 3 more steps. He didn't ask if I was all right. He pointed at Ethan and said he had always known what was really going on, that Ethan had been waiting for an opening, and I had given him one. His voice was cold and precise, the same tone he used in courtrooms, and in that moment I understood that he had been building this case in his head for a long time before he decided to say it out loud. I told him that Ethan had seen my tears because my husband had stopped seeing them. Daniel turned that sentence over in his mind for exactly 2 seconds and then used it as a confession. He said I had just told him everything he needed to know. Then he told me about the house in Seabrook Heights, the one he had already signed a lease on 1 week earlier, while I was still cooking dinner and leaving the porch light on for him. He said the new place suited the future he was building. He didn't say whether that future included Claire. He didn't need to. The answer was in every word he didn't say. The divorce petition arrived at my stall 5 days later. Daniel delivered it himself, walked into the market on a Friday morning, set the envelope down on my stall between 2 customers, and left without a word, the way you discard something you've already decided has no value. Inside, he accused me of maintaining an inappropriate relationship with Ethan Parker. He claimed the emotional distance and instability I had brought to the marriage had made it irreparable. He argued he was entitled to the house in Riverside District because the deed was in his name. He called me uneducated. He called me a source of reputational damage. He described himself as a patient man who had tried everything. That was the moment something in me went very still, not broken still. I stopped crying. I stopped hoping. I called Robert Lawson. Robert was a retired attorney who had wound down his practice to take on occasional family law cases that mattered to him personally. Years ago, when he was a young legal aide drowning in debt after a career setback, he had come to my stall and bought fish on credit for weeks because he couldn't afford groceries. I never made him feel ashamed about it. I just wrote his name in the blue notebook and told him to pay when he could. He had never forgotten that, and when I called him and explained what Daniel had filed, he said he would represent me and that we should start immediately. Robert told me to bring him everything. Every receipt, every bank transfer, every text message from Daniel asking me to cover a payment that was coming due. I went home and pulled out the blue notebook and 5 years of paper records I had kept in a shoebox under the bed. There were tuition receipts with my signature on the payment line. There were transfer confirmations from my account to Daniel's dated across every semester of law school. There were text messages where Daniel wrote things like, "The registration deadline is Friday, I'm still short by 400, and the bar prep course starts Monday, can you handle it?" There were receipts for the dress shoes I bought him for mock trial and the suit I put on a payment plan, so he'd have something to wear to his first firm interview. Robert looked through all of it for a long time. Then he said, "Rachel, this isn't what a wife does. This is what an investor does, and we're going to prove it." The hearing began 3 weeks later at Clayton County Family Court. Daniel's attorney stood up and called my contributions the ordinary obligations of a supportive spouse, suggesting that what I had provided was no different than what any wife might do for a husband in school. Robert let him finish, then opened the blue notebook to the first page and started reading entries into the record. Not the totals, the individual lines. 12 red snapper, 3 crates of mackerel, 20 bags of dried fish, transfer to Daniel's account for spring semester registration, transfer for textbooks, transfer for bar examination fees, page after page of it, 6 years of it, the handwriting getting smaller as the margins got tighter. The courtroom went very quiet. Linda Hayes came to testify. She told the court that she had personally vouched for me with 2 vendors who extended me credit because she knew where that money was going. She said she had watched me eat leftover fish for dinner and sell my mother's bracelet, and that she had never once heard me complain about it because I believed I was building a life with someone who would still be standing there when it was done. Ethan also took the stand. He confirmed that our relationship had been professional in every practical sense: shared delivery schedules, inventory, coordination, the kind of contact that came with doing business together over several years. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He told the court that he had developed personal feelings for me, and that he was disclosing it himself because it was true and because he had never acted on it. He said he had never touched me outside the ordinary course of daily business. He said he had drawn a line for himself, and he had not crossed it. Daniel's attorney tried to use the admission to suggest something illicit, but Robert pointed out to the judge that a man who volunteers an inconvenient truth is not the same as a man who is hiding one. The argument landed. It was after Ethan's testimony during a recess that Patricia found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She had been sitting in the gallery every day watching. I expected another warning, another version of the same message she had delivered at the market years ago. Instead, she stood in front of me and started talking about a sewing shop. She had owned one, she said, when Daniel was very young, a small alterations business she had built with her own hands and her own equipment. Daniel's father had convinced her to sell the machines and the inventory to fund a business venture of his. She had believed in him. The venture failed. He died before the debt was cleared, leaving her with nothing and a child to raise alone. She told me all of this in the same measured tone she used for everything, as though the feelings behind the words had been carefully pressed flat over many years of practice. Then she looked at me and said that when she watched me selling fish to pay for her son's education, she had seen herself, and that instead of protecting me from what she knew was coming, she had pushed Daniel further away from me because she was afraid. Afraid that her son would end up trapped in a small life the way she had been. I stood in that hallway and looked at this woman who had shown up at my stall years ago with barely disguised contempt, and I felt something unexpected, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. She had been hurt into becoming someone who hurt people. That didn't make what she had done to me acceptable, but it made her human in a way I hadn't let myself consider before. I told her that because she had survived what she survived, she should have been the first person to stand next to me. Instead, she had handed her son a reason to be ashamed of the woman who loved him. Patricia didn't argue. She just nodded once slowly and walked back into the courtroom. What none of us knew yet was that the worst moment for my case hadn't happened yet. Daniel's attorney was still holding something back, and when he finally put it on the table, it nearly took everything I had built in that courtroom apart. Daniel's attorney introduced the loan document on the fourth day of the hearing, and he did it the way experienced lawyers introduce things they know will detonate quietly, without any visible satisfaction, setting it on the table like it had always been there. It was a credit agreement from the Port Clayton Small Vendors Cooperative, dated roughly 8 months before Daniel sat for the bar exam. The document listed Daniel Carter as a co-guarantor on a loan I had taken out to cover his final round of bar preparation, costs his overdue rent, and the cost of replacing the chest freezer that had died during the heat wave. His name was on the paperwork. His signature was not. I had listed him without asking him, without telling him, and without any intention of ever letting him find out, because by the time I signed those forms, I had already learned that asking Daniel for anything made him feel like he was being reminded of a debt he wanted to forget. I had nearly paid off the full balance through fish sales by the time the divorce was filed, but nearly wasn't completely, and the name on that document was real, and Daniel's attorney knew exactly what he had. He asked me directly in open court whether I had used Daniel Carter's name as a guarantor on a financial instrument without his knowledge or consent. Robert had prepared me for this moment. He had told me the night before that how I answered this question would matter more than the answer itself, that a court reads character as much as it reads evidence, and that what I did in the next 60 seconds would either confirm or contradict everything we had spent 4 days establishing. I told the truth. I said yes, I had listed Daniel's name on the loan agreement without telling him. I explained that at the time his registration deadline was 72 hours away, the landlord on his apartment had sent a final notice, and I had already sold or borrowed against every asset I had. I said I was not proud of the decision, and that I had made it in the specific desperation of someone who had already given everything they had and was being asked to give more. I said I understood it was wrong, and I said it clearly without excuses and without crying because I had made a mistake and I was not going to dress it up as something else. Megan stood up from the gallery before Robert could respond. The judge reminded her she was not on the stand, and she sat back down, but not before saying loudly enough for the whole room to hear that she had been the one who told me to find a way to make that payment happen, and that if the court wanted to assign blame, it should distribute it more evenly. The judge asked her to remain quiet. She crossed her arms and did technically remain quiet, though the expression on her face made clear she considered the request unreasonable. Daniel's attorney moved immediately. He told the court that this admission demonstrated a pattern of financial deception, that a woman willing to list a name without consent was a woman capable of manufacturing the entire narrative of sacrifice and devotion that had been presented over the preceding days. He suggested the blue notebook itself could have been altered. He suggested Linda's testimony was the loyalty of a friend rather than the reliability of a witness. He suggested Ethan's voluntary admission of personal feelings was a calculated move coached by Robert to appear honest while concealing the truth. It was a skillful argument. I watched 2 members of the gallery shift in their seats. I watched the judge write something down, and I felt the floor of everything I had built begin to move under me. Robert didn't respond with volume. He responded with the loan repayment records, every payment I had made against that balance documented in bank statements and cross-referenced against entries in the blue notebook, showing that I had been quietly clearing the debt from my own earnings for nearly 2 years without ever asking Daniel to contribute a cent to an obligation that technically bore his name. He told the court that a woman executing a financial scheme for personal gain does not spend 2 years paying it back in silence. Then Robert said something I hadn't expected. He told the court that Rachel Brooks had done one thing wrong in this marriage, had admitted it without being cornered, and had already made it right to the extent that she could. He asked them to consider how that compared to a husband who had spent months constructing a story about infidelity from a single image of his wife crying near another man, a story he had used to file legal accusations, damage a woman's reputation, and attempt to take a house she had paid for and maintained largely on her own. The room went quiet in a different way after that. While the legal proceedings continued, something was happening at Harrison and Blake that I only learned about afterward. Claire Bennett had been watching the case from a distance, not attending the hearings, but reading the filings, listening to what Daniel told her, and placing his version of events alongside the documented record. She was a lawyer. Reading documents and noticing inconsistencies was not a skill she turned off when she left the office. She asked Daniel one afternoon to walk her through the evidence of the affair. Not the feelings, not the suspicions, the evidence. She asked whether he had ever seen me kiss Ethan. He said no. She asked whether he had ever found messages between us that were romantic in nature. He said no. She asked what he had actually witnessed with his own eyes, and Daniel described the morning behind Bayfront Cold Storage, me sitting on the ground, crying, Ethan, standing nearby, neither of us touching. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You turned a moment of your wife crying alone into a legal accusation of adultery. Not because you believed it. Because you needed a reason to leave that made you look like the one who had been wronged." Daniel tried to redirect the conversation. Claire didn't let him. She told him she had no interest in building a future with a man who required another woman to be made smaller so that he could appear larger. She said it without cruelty and without drama, the way you state a conclusion after examining the evidence. Then she gathered her files and returned to her own office, and that was the end of whatever Daniel had imagined was possible between them. The house in Seabrook Heights, which Daniel had signed for with the confidence of a man who believed he was walking into a better life, became very quiet after that. He went to his mother. Patricia had been attending the hearings every day, sitting in the same seat in the gallery watching everything. When Daniel came to her and said that Claire had left, that his reputation at the firm had been affected by the publicity of the case, and that the life he had been constructing was not coming together the way he had planned, Patricia did not comfort him the way he expected. She told him about his father, not the version she had always told, softened and simplified, but the complete one. She described selling her sewing machines. She described liquidating her entire inventory because a man she loved told her it was an investment in their shared future. She described waiting for the return that never came and learning after his death that the debt had been real and the plan had not been. Then she said, "I gave you a poison and told you it was wisdom. But you're the one who chose to drink it, Daniel. You made those choices. Don't put them at my feet now that they've cost you something." Daniel had no answer for that. Some truths are too precisely aimed to deflect. The judge delivered the ruling on a Thursday morning. She stated that the evidence presented did not meet the standard required to establish an improper romantic relationship between Rachel Brooks and Ethan Parker. She noted that Ethan's testimony, specifically his voluntary disclosure of personal feelings, combined with his clear account of the boundaries he had maintained, was credible precisely because he had not attempted to present himself as neutral. On the question of financial contribution, the court found that Rachel's support of Daniel's legal education constituted a documentable, sustained, and substantial investment that went well beyond ordinary marital support. The blue notebook, the bank records, the vendor testimonies, and the loan repayment history together formed a picture that the court was not willing to dismiss as the routine behavior of a supportive spouse. Regarding the loan document, the court found that Rachel had committed an error, not a fraud, but an error made under documented financial duress, and that the remaining balance would be factored into the financial settlement as an obligation of the marital estate, rather than evidence of character. The divorce was granted. The accusation of infidelity was dismissed. The house on Riverside District remained mine. I received a financial settlement calculated against 6 years of contributions to his education, career preparation, and household maintenance. The judge did not editorialize. She simply read the findings, signed the order, and moved to the next case. I sat in that courtroom and let it settle over me, not triumph, nothing as clean as that. More like the feeling of putting down something you have been carrying so long, you forgot it had weight. Daniel was waiting outside the courthouse when I walked out. He was alone, standing near the bottom of the steps in a suit that still fit him, the way expensive things fit people who have stopped earning them. He said Claire had left. He said the house felt empty. He said he had spent the drive over trying to find the right words and had finally decided that the only true thing he could say was that he had been wrong and that I was the only home he had ever actually had, and he wanted to know if there was any version of the future where we could begin again. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger because the anger had burned itself out somewhere during those 4 days in the courtroom. What I felt was something quieter and more final than anger. I told him, "You were right about one thing, Daniel. I was your home, and you burned it down and then complained that you had nowhere warm to go." He started to speak, and I kept going. I told him I forgave him, because carrying what he had done to me into the rest of my life would cost me more than it would cost him, and I had already given him enough. But forgiveness, I told him, was not the same as return. I was not going back to a man who had only discovered my value once someone else had confirmed it by walking away. That wasn't love. That was inventory. I walked down the steps and crossed the parking lot to where Ethan was standing by his truck, far enough away to have given us privacy, close enough that I could see he had been there the whole time. He hadn't approached during the conversation with Daniel. He hadn't positioned himself to be noticed. He was just there in the uncomplicated way he had always been there, present, patient, not asking for anything. When I reached him, he said, "I've been here the whole time, Rachel. Not because I was waiting for him to fail, because I wanted you to know that someone was in your corner before you knew the verdict." I didn't answer right away. I just said, "Walk slow." He nodded. We walked. The market was open when we got back. Linda was at her stall and pretended not to watch us come in, which meant she watched every second. Megan handed me a coffee without a word, and then went back to reorganizing a display she had clearly already finished reorganizing. That afternoon, I used the first money from the settlement to order a new chest freezer, the good one, the commercial-grade unit I had been putting off for 6 years. I hired 2 women from the Riverside district who had been looking for steady work. I called the sign company I had been meaning to call since the whole thing started. The sign went up the following week. White letters on a navy background, clean and plain and permanent. Rachel's Harbor Seafood, owned by Rachel Brooks. I opened the blue notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date at the top, and started a new column. No entries for tuition. No transfers to anyone else's account. Just inventory sales and the name of a business that belonged entirely to me. I had spent 6 years selling fish to build someone else's future. It turned out I had also been, without realizing it, learning exactly how to build my own. Here's what I want you to take from Rachel's story. The people who stand beside you when you have nothing are not stepping stones. They are not there to be used and left behind once you've climbed high enough. Real character doesn't show up in the title on your office door or the neighborhood you move into. It shows up in how you treat the people who knew you before any of that existed. Rachel made mistakes. She wasn't perfect. But she looked at every one of her mistakes with open eyes and said, "That was me, and I own it." Daniel couldn't do the same. And that difference between someone who faces their wrongs and someone who rewrites them is the difference that matters most in the end. If you've ever given everything to someone who treated your sacrifice like a stepping stone, know this: walking away from a place that asked you to disappear is not failure. It's the first honest thing you've done for yourself in a long time. And if there's a blue notebook somewhere in your life, a record of everything you've quietly carried, don't let anyone use it against you. Let it remind you of what you're capable of building. If Rachel's story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you stories about people who were written off, written out, and came back and wrote their own ending. You don't want to miss what's coming next.